The invasion of Sicily, known by its military designation Operation Husky, represented a monumental turning point in the Second World War. It was the very first time the Western Allied powers executed a large-scale offensive against territory considered part of the Axis homeland. This campaign, launched in the summer of 1943, was intended to seize control of the strategically vital island and pave the way for future operations against the European continent. However, Operation Husky was more than just a clash between the Allies and the Axis forces. It was also the theater for a significant internal conflict, a fierce battle of wills and egos fought between high-ranking commanders, most notably Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. of the American forces and General Bernard Law Montgomery leading the British Eighth Army. The core issue that made Operation Husky so crucial was the need for the American and British armies to resolve deep-seated differences in doctrine, equipment, and perception. Prior to the landings, the British High Command harbored significant doubts about the readiness and competence of the American fighting man. The British had been engaged in combat against the armies of both Hitler and Mussolini for 3 long years, often standing virtually alone against the Axis powers. This extended experience led many in the King's Army to view the newly arrived American forces, sometimes referred to informally as Roosevelt's boys, as lacking in necessary training, proper motivation, and general ability. This negative assessment stemmed largely from the initial struggles and poor performance of inexperienced American troops during the North African campaign. The Allied planners of Operation Husky, heavily influenced by British perspectives, had initially assigned the Americans what was perceived as a secondary or supporting role in the planned invasion of Sicily. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., commander of the United States Seventh Army, was fiercely determined to use the Sicilian campaign to definitively prove that the American soldier was the absolute equal of any army in the field, whether friend or foe. This resolve turned the military operation into an intense, unspoken contest for prestige and recognition. Beyond the purely military goals, the success of the alliance itself rested on resolving these fundamental issues. Prime Minister Winston Churchill once noted that Great Britain and America were two people separated by a common language, but the divisions extended far beyond mere dialect. Differences in military equipment, variations in tactical doctrine, and the powerful, contrasting attitudes and personalities of the commanding generals all significantly impacted the operation and the campaign's trajectory. For the Allies to effectively continue their confrontation against the Axis powers, they were required to work through these deep-seated problems and forge a truly collaborative fighting force. The Sicilian campaign became the proving ground where the future cooperation of the Western Allies would be tested and defined. Background theory. Before the invasion of Sicily commenced, the American military had faced its first taste of heavy combat against the Axis during the campaign in North Africa. Specifically, the engagement at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia proved to be a difficult introduction to warfare for the American forces. The troops who arrived in Africa were only partially trained, and they were, according to historical accounts, handled clumsily by their commanders. This inexperience resulted in poor outcomes, highlighting the urgent necessity to strengthen combat leadership, improve discipline, and implement better training, particularly in specialized areas such as patrolling, reconnaissance, and the crucial coordination of combined arms units. It's important to note that while the Americans were struggling initially, the British Army itself had also experienced a difficult time, with little going well for them until a few months before the Sicilian invasion. Yet this previous struggle did not stop the British High Command from maintaining a deeply negative and pessimistic view of the American Army. This skepticism was so pervasive that even Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the overall theater commander, registered a formal complaint about the attitude. Several senior British generals, including General Sir Harold Alexander and General Bernard Law Montgomery, were known for not concealing their disrespect for their American counterparts. A telling example occurred during the latter stages of the Tunisian campaign, when Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson's British First Army, which included an American corps, demonstrated this dismissive attitude. Major General Ernest Harmon, the commander of the United States 1st Armored Division, briefed Anderson on his plan for deploying troops in the rugged terrain of northern Tunisia. Following the briefing, Anderson famously shook his head and muttered twice, calling the plan just a childish fantasy, before walking away. Ironically, by this time, American Army leaders in North Africa were already achieving success in significantly improving the performance of their units, but the British generals somehow remained largely unaware of these critical advancements. Compounding the problem was a perceived lack of understanding among the British regarding the inherent differences in equipment and tactical doctrine. American forces possessed a superior logistical structure and better vehicles, allowing them to move much faster than the British troops. The British, for instance, lacked rugged 2.5-ton trucks and capable artillery-pulling tractors, a deficit that would later require Eisenhower to assign American truck companies to the British forces to accelerate their movement across Europe. Nevertheless, Alexander and Montgomery initially intended for the British Eighth Army to be the primary force tasked with defeating the Axis troops in Sicily, with the Americans merely relegated to protecting the British left flank. General Montgomery, known for his fastidious approach to warfare, was a complex figure. His focus was heavily centered on the military profession, which he studied rigorously throughout his life. Despite his brilliance, Montgomery was an extremely difficult individual who frequently infuriated people. He possessed a notable inability to see any perspective other than his own, or to appreciate the negative impact his incessant arguing and constant nagging had on his personal and professional relationships. Montgomery's initial plan for the attack on Sicily was clear. The British Eighth Army would drive northward along the island's eastern coast, while Patton's United States Seventh Army would be responsible for securing and protecting his left flank. Montgomery faced criticism for his desire to have every minor detail perfectly established before initiating even a limited, set-piece attack. His army style favored set-piece, limited objective assaults, a specialty derived from the kind of army he commanded. His famous victory at El Alamein was a classic set-piece attack that only began when he was completely ready, a model he repeated in Tunisia and Normandy. However, this cautious approach sometimes contrasted sharply with the operational style of the Americans. German observers, by comparison, found the American army to be extraordinarily flexible and remarked on their ability to adapt immediately to rapidly changing situations. This flexibility was rooted in a long American tradition of quickly moving to exploit an enemy that was caught unprepared or off balance. Lieutenant General George S. Patton presented an equally complex yet contrasting personality. He was arguably one of the best American fighting generals of the war and deserved considerable credit for the performance improvements seen in the American Army units during the Tunisia campaign. Patton was a brilliant intellectual, fluent in the French language and grounded in French culture. Though he could be quite charming, he cultivated a deliberate facade, which he referred to as his war face, designed to project an image of hardness and fierceness, believing this would make him a more effective commander. While Patton was known for sometimes seeking the limelight and exhibited despicable conduct toward wounded soldiers he wrongly deemed cowards, he also demonstrated genuine, hidden compassion, such as being found crying in a latrine after visiting an amputee ward. In terms of command structure, the overall Mediterranean theater commander, Lieutenant General Dwight I.D. Eisenhower, played a limited role in the Sicilian campaign. This reduced authority was a consequence of the British having successfully persuaded the Allies to adopt their traditional command setup for this operation. This structure functioned as a committee, composed of the theater commander, the Army Group commander, and the two Army commanders. If both the Army commander and the Army Group commander agreed on a course of action, Eisenhower had little power to override their collective decision. Despite Eisenhower's exceptional skill in using persuasion and hints, this committee arrangement ultimately proved ineffective and worked poorly. The Army Group commander, General the Honorable Sir Harold Alexander, was well regarded for his easy, smiling grace and contagious confidence, and held multiple, well-deserved decorations for valor earned during World War I. However, one British officer who worked closely with Alexander noted that he had never produced an original idea. Alexander also possessed two other significant failings: a consistent failure to grasp the reins of higher command, and, critically, a pervasive, complete lack of faith in the American soldier, even in the face of American successes. Alexander's dim view of the Americans persisted even later in the Italian campaign, when the American army was clearly supporting the exhausted Eighth Army. At one point, he disparaged the training level of the American Army to visiting General George C. Marshall, who retorted that American troops, while making typical beginner's mistakes, learned from them remarkably quickly.
Initially, Montgomery shared Alexander's negative assessment of the American army, but after witnessing its impressive mobility and flexibility firsthand, he realized these virtues were not fully shared by the British army under his command.
Sicily itself presented a daunting military landscape. The island is characterized by rugged mountains. The northeastern tip, which contains the city of Messina near the Italian mainland, is overshadowed by Mount Etna. The approach to Messina is restricted, running either along a narrow route on the south coast or through the challenging, rugged mountains north of the massive volcano. The limited cover available for advancing troops, combined with dusty roads, open fields, and numerous observation points on high mountains, meant that even a relatively small force utilizing artillery could be highly effective in defense. Sicilian towns are typically situated on ridge tops. Furthermore, the island in the summer is hot, dry, and yet paradoxically humid, and it was also known to be disease-ridden.
In the summer of 1943, Sicily's defense force was sizable, consisting of between 300,000 and 350,000 German and Italian troops. The Italian Sixth Army commanded over 200,000 of these men. However, this large number was deceptive because the Italian units were generally poorly led, poorly equipped, and poorly armed. Moreover, a deep war weariness and disillusionment with fascism had set in among many Italian soldiers. They were initially supported by two German divisions. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, though still forming, retained its capability for effective fighting. It was held in reserve, with one regiment deployed in the western half of the island, one attached to the Italian Sixth Army in the center, and another in the east attached to the Luftwaffe's Hermann Göring Panzer Division. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division was a peculiar unit. Throughout much of the war, the Luftwaffe's parachute divisions were exceptionally motivated, well-trained, and well-equipped, but its regular infantry and panzer divisions were not. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division had originated as Göring's largely ceremonial guard regiment, and after being expanded to division strength, most of it had been destroyed in Tunisia. Consequently, it was being reconstituted, or as one historian described it, cobbled together, primarily using personnel the Luftwaffe could spare from other duties. These men typically possessed little experience or training in ground fighting. Furthermore, according to the division's chief of staff, much of the leadership was not capable of handling their responsibilities. The only notable exceptions were the division's artillery batteries, which were both well-trained and experienced. Due to Germany's material shortages, extensive use was made of captured equipment, and even this was becoming increasingly scarce. It seemed bizarre then to equip an inexperienced, partly trained, and poorly led unit with first-rate equipment. Yet, because the Hermann Göring Panzer Division was designated an elite unit, it received the only company of Tiger tanks present on the island, which were transferred from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. Adding to its operational problems, the division's headquarters and about two-thirds of its strength were moved to the Caltagirone area near Gela on the southern shore, just before the Allied invasion. The remaining forces, along with the attached Panzer Grenadier Regiment, were situated near Catania under the command of Colonel Wilhelm Schmalz. Before the conclusion of the campaign, the Germans would reinforce their position by introducing the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division and the 1st Parachute Division. Axis air power was severely diminished by the time of the invasion. The Italian Air Force was a mere shadow of its former capability. The Luftwaffe's presence was reduced to a small number of badly worn Messerschmitt Me 109 fighter planes flown by exhausted pilots. Focke-Wulf fighter planes and bomber squadrons had already been pulled back to Sardinia. Axis naval activity was limited almost entirely to logistical operations, such as supplying the island and later evacuating forces. The Allied air effort was commanded by American Major General Carl Spaatz, leading the Northwest African Air Force. Major General James Jimmy Doolittle commanded the bomber units, and Air Vice Marshal Arthur Cunningham led the tactical air units. The Allies enjoyed a clear advantage, possessing more and superior aircraft, along with better trained pilots. However, many of the Allied fighter aircraft had only short-range capabilities. Flying from bases in Malta and Tunisia, they had very little flight time remaining once they reached the airspace over Sicily. This strategic limitation made the prompt capture of Sicilian airfields an imperative goal for the Allies. Compounding the air support difficulties were issues with training and doctrine. The transport units lacked adequate training in night formation flying. Furthermore, Allied ground support doctrine emphasized wide-ranging sweeps aimed at hunting down enemy columns and supply convoys.
This doctrine meant that very few aircraft were available to provide immediate direct support to ground troops who were actually engaged in fast-moving battles. The United States Army and Navy found the Army Air Force, a separate branch at the time, to be uncooperative. They ignored requests for aerial photographs of the American landing beaches until Major General Lucien Truscott, commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, was forced to appeal directly to General Spaatz. Historian Carlo d'Este attributed the root of this uncooperation to the Air Force commander's desire to maintain the independence of the air services. There was almost an arrogant insistence among these commanders that air power alone could successfully win the war in Europe, perhaps even without requiring a full invasion of the continent. In contrast, Allied naval units were powerful enough to successfully transport a large invasion force to the island with surprisingly minimal losses. The naval forces also provided highly effective gunfire support for the initial landing operations. The invasion commenced on July 10, 1943. General Montgomery's British 8th Army landed on the eastern side of the southeastern point of Sicily. The 8th Army consisted of 2 corps. Lieutenant General Sir Oliver Leese's 30th Corps, which included the 1st Canadian Division, the 51st Highland Division, and the independent 231st Infantry Brigade, was scheduled to move northwesterly to establish contact with Patton's forces near Ragusa. Notably, the Canadian troops sailed directly from chilly Scotland into the intense heat and humidity of Sicily. Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey's 13th Corps, comprising the 5th and 50th Divisions, landed further east in the Gulf of Noto. This corps had been assigned an ambitious set of objectives, starting with the capture of Syracuse and the entire coastal area, including the Catania Plain up to the flanks of the volcanic Mount Etna. The British Army Reserve, consisting of the British 78th Division and the 1st Canadian Tank Brigade, remained in Tunisia temporarily.
Simultaneously, Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr.'s United States 7th Army assaulted the coastline, landing in the Gulf of Gela, spanning from Licata to Pozzallo. Their immediate objective was to capture the nearby airfields. Major General Omar Bradley's 2nd Corps was tasked with landing the 1st Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, on the beaches located east of Gela. An ad hoc formation, designated X-Force, built around the 1st and 3rd Ranger Battalions, a battalion of combat engineers, 3 chemical mortar companies, and an engineer shore battalion, was assigned the direct assault on Gela City itself. Major General Troy Middleton's 45th Infantry Division would land at Scogliti on the right flank of the landing zone. A separate force called Joss Force, which included Truscott's 3rd Infantry Division plus the 3rd Ranger Battalion, would land near Licata and anchor the far left flank of the entire American landing area. The American troops of the 2nd Armored Division were greeted warmly by the citizens of Palermo on July 22, 1943, feeling that they had proved their quality against both enemies and allies during the month-long battle. Gela was identified as the most critical yet most vulnerable of all the landing spots. The key to securing success at Gela lay in controlling the high ground located approximately 5 miles inland. Highway 117 ran north from Gela, crossing a ridge between 2 hills, and continued toward Nisemi, Enna, and eventually the north coast. This road was crucial because roads from Caltagirone and Vittoria fed into it, meaning any Axis troops moving south to launch a counterattack would inevitably use this route. A well-constructed strongpoint known as the Piano Lupo controlled traffic along these vital roads. Colonel James Gavin's 505th Paratroop Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division, along with an attached battalion, was ordered to land inland from Gela and secured this ridge. Allen's 1st Infantry Division was tasked with advancing as swiftly as possible to relieve them. Further south, about 4 miles from the beach, lay additional high ground overlooking the Biscari Road and the Biscari-Gela Road Junction. Americans dubbed this location the Biazzo Ridge, and paratroopers were also slated to land there. The 9th Infantry Division remained in Army Reserve in North Africa with its 39th Regimental Combat Team and the rest of the division artillery ready for immediate deployment. The remainder of the 82nd Airborne Division was also available to drop onto the island. While the British landings in their sector were described as anticlimactic, the American beaches experienced significant confusion, and the paratroopers were widely scattered due to issues with the drop. Nevertheless, by early morning on July 11th, it was evident that both the British and American landings were achieving success, albeit slowly. The Axis forces recognized that their only chance lay in smashing the landings during the first critical hours when the invasion was at its most vulnerable, given the superior, better trained, and better equipped Allied ground forces.
Consequently, they focused their primary counterattack on the Gela landing zone on D-Day. The plan called for Italian forces to launch the initial counterattack, followed by the more heavily armed German units to complete the destruction of the lodgment. Should that fail, the retreating Axis forces were instructed to inflict maximum possible losses on the advancing Allies as they fell back toward Messina. The Axis plan intended for German and Italian units to execute a coordinated attack on the beachhead, but severe communication problems and the demonstrated incompetence of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division resulted in disastrous piecemeal attacks instead. Initially, 2 Italian columns from Gruppo Mobile E attempted to drive the Americans out. The eastern column proceeded south along the Nishimi Road toward the Italian strongpoint at the Piano Lupo road junction as anticipated. Before reaching it, they ran into a blocking position established by men from Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Gorham's 505th Paratroop Infantry Regiment. The Americans successfully ambushed the approaching Italian column and repelled a subsequent attack. Italian artillery opened fire, allowing the Italian troops to fall back, though the position at the crucial road junction was now in American hands. As the Italians prepared to maneuver, naval gunfire began to strike their positions, directed by an observer from the 1st Division's 26th Infantry Regiment, which was approaching from the beach. The Italian infantry took cover, but the tanks continued their advance toward Gela. There, they were met by the 16th Infantry, which successfully knocked out several tanks and compelled the remainder to retreat into the surrounding hills.
The Western Gruppo Mobile A column also attempted a tank and infantry attack on Gela. Coordination was extremely poor, resulting in the tanks arriving first, completely unsupported by infantry. The American Rangers swiftly drove the tanks out of the city. They then ambushed the enemy infantry when they finally arrived, destroying the force with the crucial assistance of naval gunfire. The available units of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, equivalent to about 1 American regimental combat team, were formed into 2 battle groups, known as Kampfgruppen, and slated to attack early in the morning. However, the division's lack of cohesion, poor training, and unfamiliarity with the area delayed the start of their move until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The Western Hermann Göring Panzer Division column, a tank-heavy force aimed at the Gela area, advanced well until it encountered Gorham's 505th Paratroopers, who had been reinforced by elements of the 16th Infantry and were in direct communication with naval warships offshore. The attack collapsed in the face of accurate small arms fire, mortars, and concentrated naval artillery. The Eastern Hermann Göring Panzer Division column, consisting of 2 battalions of Panzer Grenadiers and a company of Tiger tanks, fared even worse. 2 of the notoriously temperamental Tiger tanks broke down. Furthermore, the column was repeatedly forced to countermarch to navigate narrow village streets and other terrain obstructions. The Panzer Grenadiers reached the American positions first, but were halted by a small number of infantrymen, supported only by their mortars. A major factor contributing to this failure was the commander of the Panzer Grenadiers, who was a grounded bomber pilot, removed from flying due to nerves, and had absolutely no training or experience in ground fighting. The commander was promptly replaced, and the Grenadiers launched a renewed attack against the thinly held out posts of the 45th Division's 1st Battalion of the 180th Infantry. This second attempt succeeded in overrunning the Americans, capturing a large part of the battalion and pushing the remainder back until they encountered the 3rd Battalion of the 180th Infantry, which managed to hold its position. Later that same day, German tank and infantry columns attacked once more. Small arms fire managed to stop the infantry, and more naval gunfire rained down on the tanks. In a mass panic, born largely of their inexperience, the Grenadiers retreated in complete disorder, and the attack was eventually called off by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The American landing received no direct air support. None of the requested flights arrived. Instead, the air effort consisted of squadron-sized sweeps of enemy-held territory by P-38s and P-51s configured as dive bombers, which failed to prevent the Axis columns from advancing to attack. Despite this, Axis aircraft were plentiful, flying 481 sorties against the beachhead. That night brought a tragic episode when more paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division arrived. Once again, poor mission planning and a lack of training among the air crews resulted in a serious mistake. In a terrible blunder, the flight path of the troop carriers passed directly over the Allied fleet and the invasion beaches, which were armed with anti-aircraft guns manned by exhausted and jittery soldiers and sailors.
Many of the paratroopers were misdropped or were killed by friendly fire. The Air Force had refused to provide the United States Army and Navy with the exact routes of their aircraft until it was too late to ensure all anti-aircraft gunners were properly notified. In fairness to the gunners, they had already faced sporadic attacks throughout the day and a night attack by the Luftwaffe. This failure of communication caused another fiasco that cost additional American lives. American aircraft were shot down by American gunners, and other planes were scattered, making the dispersal of the paratroopers worse than the previous drop. 23 aircraft vanished, presumably falling into the sea. In a surprising outcome, however, some paratroopers actually landed in or very close to their designated drop zones. The following day, known as D+1, proved to be the most crucial period in the entire battle for Sicily. During the night's respite, the Americans had advanced several miles inland, allowing their defenders to engage the attackers further away from the actual beaches. The Montgomery and Livorno divisions prepared 6 coordinated columns for the attack. Their assault succeeded in pushing back the American outpost line, including the paratroopers' crucial blocking position, and penetrated deep into the beachhead. This came, however, at a tremendous cost. The Livorno division's columns attacked the Rangers around Gela, across harvested wheat fields. They suffered more than 50% casualties before finally being forced back. The Livorno division was effectively eliminated as a viable forcing force after this encounter. A German panzer column managed to break through the 1st Division positions and entered the Gela plain, firing upon the supply dumps. The American infantry resisted fiercely, utilizing bazookas and anti-tank guns, successfully destroying several panzers. As the morning progressed, American mortars and artillery began to play an increasingly significant role. More guns were brought forward, and Sherman tanks, which had been previously hindered by soft sand and barbed wire clogging their tracks, broke free. The Sherman 75mm guns outranged the 50mm guns on the Panzer III tanks, which constituted the bulk of the German attack, and possessed superior penetration power. The Panzer's attack was eventually repulsed, inflicting heavy losses on the Germans. The importance of Allied naval support during this stage cannot be overstated. The guns of the ships offshore provided firepower equivalent to 4 or 5 battalions of medium artillery. They incessantly pounded the German columns as they advanced, ceasing only when the enemy units mingled directly with American positions. As the enemy retreated, the naval guns resumed their bombardment, pummeling the broken remnants of the Axis forces. East of the Gela plain, the 180th Infantry was pushed back toward the beach. Here again, naval fire support was pivotal, with the destroyer Beatty firing 800 rounds of 5-inch shells directly into the advancing Germans.
Near the eastern flank of the lodgment, Colonel Gavin, who had been dropped far from his intended location, arrived in time to organize scattered groups of paratroops and men of the 45th Division. They formed a thinly stretched defense line along the Biazza Ridge. This improvised defense was supported only by a few 81mm mortars and 2 75mm howitzers. The rocky shale of the ridge prevented the defenders from digging in effectively. The Germans continued to suffer the price of staffing the Hermann Göring Panzer Division with poorly prepared Luftwaffe personnel. They were described as nervous, and their attacks were disorganized and lacked proper aggressiveness. This lack of determination was fortunate for the American soldiers, given the, quote, vast mismatch in strength between the two opposing sides at the ridge. Throughout the day, small American units and individual soldiers joined the fight. Towards evening, 6 Sherman tanks arrived, enabling Gavin to mount a counterattack. The Germans then broke off their offensive and shifted to a defensive posture. General Allen, a staunch proponent of striking an enemy while it was disoriented, ordered his 1st Division to launch another night attack that evening. For the first 3 days, the British 8th Army encountered only negligible opposition and drove their troops hard to capitalize on the weak resistance. Their swift advance up the eastern coast was finally checked when they ran into Team Schmaltz, east of Syracuse. A serious problem for the Allies arose from the combination of the British failure to recognize the extent of the American Army's improvements and General Alexander's reluctance to commit to a detailed plan for the campaign beyond the initial landings. Alexander admitted after the war that he had not developed an overall plan for Sicily's conquest beyond securing the landing areas, preferring instead to observe how the situation developed. Once the beachheads were sufficiently large to permit a logistical buildup and provide room for maneuver, his general intention was to strike north across the island. However, this intention was never formalized into a detailed operational plan. On July 13th, Alexander visited Patton's headquarters, accompanied by a party that notably excluded any of the American liaison officers assigned to him. Both Patton and Bradley felt insulted by this slight. Alexander should have learned during that meeting that Patton's troops were fighting effectively and were positioned perfectly to push across the island. Major General Bradley expected his Second Corps to move north along the axis from Vizi to Enna. The established inter-army boundary lay east of the road connecting these two towns, and Bradley reasonably inferred from Alexander's silence that he had tacit permission to proceed. Alexander did give Patton permission to extend the American beachhead further west toward the vicinity of Agrigento, provided he avoided engaging in any major combat. Critically, Alexander failed to disclose that he had already decided that the British Eighth Army would be the one to spearhead the advance across the island. The Americans were now expected merely to hold their current positions and shield General Montgomery's left flank. Alexander's order, issued on the evening of the 13th, mandated that the Eighth Army move aggressively to trap the Axis forces facing the Americans. Alexander made this unilateral decision before Montgomery had even developed the same idea and proposed it to his superior the day prior. Alexander's exact motivation for this decision can only be inferred. He seemed fixed on the necessity of protecting Montgomery's left flank from a potential counterattack originating from the western part of the island. Yet by July 12, the Allies were intercepting substantial signal intelligence, clearly indicating that only a few small German units remained in that area. While a considerable number of Italian troops were present, they were viewed as war-weary and could effectively be disregarded. This decision by Alexander necessitated shifting the inter-army boundary significantly westward. This boundary had been established before the invasion, and Montgomery's troops had already crossed it without authorization. The shift granted the British control over the road running from Vizzini, which they had just reached, onward to Enna in central Sicily and continuing toward the north coast.
This was a fundamentally bad decision, executed poorly. On July 14, before the formal order arrived, American infantry and artillery of the 45th Division had joined the British attack on Vizzini, acting on the initiative of the local American commander. Despite the disruption of a German counterattack, the 45th Division could have committed substantially more power to the British assault on the town. Instead, the order mandating the boundary shift required the 45th Division to redeploy to the far left of the American position, a 90-mile journey that took the division out of action for several days. The reaction at Patton's headquarters upon receiving the order was one of dismay. Major General John Lucas, Eisenhower's representative at the headquarters, recorded the profound consequence. Once the momentum which we have gained is lost, momentum is difficult to regain. General Bradley remained furious about the decision decades later, when writing his second autobiography in the 1980s. The American Army was, logistically and temperamentally, the ideal force to conduct the attack across the island. It was led by Patton, a former cavalryman whose boldness would become legendary. Furthermore, the American Army was better equipped than the British, possessing more and superior supporting vehicles that provided vastly better mobility. Alexander's plan, however, reflected his underlying contempt for the American Army, a decision that tragically wasted their inherent striking power and mobility. Conversely, the British Eighth Army was poorly suited to execute the cross-island attack. Montgomery had insisted that only battle-hardened formations be assigned to the invasion. However, there was a strong feeling among these experienced troops that they had already fulfilled their obligations. Montgomery had also been greatly impressed by the desperate fighting shown by Italian units in Tunisia, especially when they fought with their backs to the sea in the final weeks of that campaign. Expecting the Italian troops in Sicily to display the same tenacity, he had allocated a large portion of his supply tonnage to ammunition, often at the expense of crucial vehicles. Many of these vehicles were subsequently lost when a ship carrying them sank. When the Italian opposition simply dissolved on contact, the Eighth Army found itself ill-prepared to fully exploit the rapid advance. The initial easy progress encouraged Montgomery to push his troops hard, urging them to advance as far as possible before German defenses could stiffen. By this time, many British soldiers had already marched over 50 miles, carrying their full gear, plus extra food and ammunition, in 100-degree humid weather.
They were severely fatigued and more than a little disheartened, a condition referred to informally as browned off. Montgomery's strategy was twofold. The 30th Corps was to drive northwesterly, moving behind the Hermann-Göring panzer troops that faced the American beachhead, intending to trap them. This corps would then continue along Highway 117 toward the north coast. Meanwhile, the 13th Corps was ordered to drive to the northeast along Highway 114 toward the Catania Plain and its valuable airfields. Almost immediately, the northwesterly drive encountered difficulties at Vizzini. Here, the 30th Corps met its first serious opposition, engaging Hermann-Göring panzer troops who were beginning to gain combat experience. The Germans successfully held the town for 2 full days. They only fell back a short distance, establishing a new position from which they continued to slow the British advance and inflict casualties. Although American artillery was excellently positioned to pound the retreating Germans, they were forbidden from firing into territory assigned to the 8th Army. Montgomery subsequently shifted his attention to the northeasterly advance. The 50th Division was to begin by clearing Team Schmalz from their positions around Lentini, while the 5th Division advanced along the coastal road. This advance could not progress significantly until the British secured 2 crucial crossings, the bridge over the Lentini River and the Primsal Bridge over the Samito River. The Lentini River Bridge was close to the sea and existing British positions. Commandos successfully captured it and were quickly relieved by advancing ground troops. The Primsal Bridge presented a much greater challenge. Elements of the Luftwaffe's 1st Parachute Division, widely considered among the most effective and determined infantry in the world, had been airdropped and were defending the east side of the river. The area surrounding the bridge was covered in orchards and vineyards, which provided excellent cover for the defenders, making any daylight attack nearly suicidal. British glider troops were assigned the mission of capturing and holding the bridge until the 50th Division arrived. The glider drop on the night of July 13 was as disorganized and scattered as the earlier paratrooper drops. A few small groups did manage to assemble near the bridge and captured it from an Italian security force. They held the bridge for 16 hours until strong German counterattacks forced the few remaining, mostly wounded glidermen to surrender. Later that day, a battalion of the Durham Light Infantry arrived near the bridge. The following morning they launched an assault that, tragically, was reminiscent of unsuccessful British attacks during the First World War in France, resulting in crippling losses. The British were preparing yet another daylight assault when Lieutenant Colonel Alastair Pearson, commander of the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Brigade, challenged the plan, remarking, "I suppose you want to see another battalion written off too." This intervention led to the commander of the 50th Division to delay the attack until late that night and agree to follow a covered, more indirect route. This night attack was initially successful. However, demonstrating a recurring problem, British radios failed at a critical juncture. The follow-up force was not ordered to advance until after daylight broke, granting the Germans valuable time to prepare their defenses. Despite this setback, the British continued to press their attack into the teeth of the German defenses until the 18th of July, sustaining further crippling losses. The entire operation, which Montgomery had designed to quickly open a route for the British to reach Messina, proved to be a failure. Catania would not fall until early August.
Patton received Alexander's restrictive order on the 13th with outward stoicism. He was unaware that, according to established British Army practice, commanders at his level were entitled to argue for an order to be modified or completely rescinded. Interestingly, Montgomery later advised Patton that if he received an order from Alexander that he disliked, he should simply ignore it, stating that was his own personal practice. Montgomery was serious in this advice. This attitude, however, was uncommon among British generals and virtually unheard of among American commanders. Following the difficult and inconsistent start in North Africa, it was deemed imperative that the American troops, the population back home in the United States, and the British allies all witness American soldiers operating with both effectiveness and boldness. For the Allied coalition to function correctly, both parties absolutely required an accurate understanding of the other's genuine strengths and weaknesses. Patton flew to Tunis to personally argue his case for an American advance to the north and west. General Alexander claimed that he had intended for Patton to do exactly that, but that his staff had simply failed to dispatch the orders yet. The subsequent plan, however, was poorly considered. The Italian troops had no fight left in them, and the German forces were abandoning that entire section of the island as fast as they possibly could. It would have required little more than 1 battalion of military police to manage the prisoners, a civil affairs detachment, and an armored division combat command to provide the necessary muscle and overrun the western half of the island. The far better plan, as General Lucas noted in his diary on the 15th, and as Bradley later confirmed in his memoirs, would have involved the bulk of the American army advancing north and east while the Germans were still developing their defenses in that sector. Patton, demonstrating American mobility, formed a provisional corps consisting of the 3rd Infantry, 82nd Airborne, 2nd Armored, and 2 Ranger battalions, tasking them with the advance to the west. This operation moved over rugged terrain and primitive roads, showcasing a brilliant demonstration of American operational mobility. One battalion famously marched 55 miles over treacherous mountain trails in just 33 hours. The advance on Palermo, located on the northern coast, began from positions the 3rd Division occupied on the American left flank around Agrigento on July 19. By noon on July 22, the 3rd Division was positioned overlooking the city of Palermo. The German strategy of withdrawal allowed them to establish a much shorter front, forcing the Allies to pay a high price for any attack. This withdrawal also created the possibility for a German counteroffensive. The Germans heavily fortified a sequence of strong points along the Etna line, which stretched from Palermo in the east to Lanforte in the west. This line directly faced the British and Canadian troops who were moving toward the northeast. The strong points effectively blocked the few viable routes through the rugged mountains. The establishment of the Etna line marked the end of the Germans' voluntary withdrawals. The thinly stretched British and Canadian units fought courageously to breach this defense. The first key objective was the capture of Asoro, which was necessary to clear the way for an attack on Leonforte. The Canadians assigned the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, affectionately known as the Hasty Peats, the task of capturing Asoro. The central linchpin of the German defenses there was an 11th century Norman castle situated atop a crag above the town, accessible only by a single winding road. The Canadian commander and an intelligence officer moved forward to assess the situation. Unfortunately, the Germans spotted the reflection from their binoculars, resulting in both officers being killed. This left Major John Stewart, the Lord Tweedsmuir, in command. He quickly organized a force of 20 volunteers and 1 officer drawn from each of his rifle companies to infiltrate the position. The plan involved climbing the sheer cliff face on the eastern side of the crag to reach the castle. The infiltration team stripped their gear down to only weapons, ammunition, water, and 1 long-range radio. On the night of July 20, they embarked on an incredibly difficult forced march in bright moonlight across some of the most rugged terrain in Sicily. They successfully reached the foot of the cliff directly below the summit. Following a hair-raising climb, they arrived at the castle and captured its only occupants, an artillery spotting team equipped with an excellent telescope, all without alerting the German troops positioned below. As the Germans prepared their morning routines, the Canadians initiated fire. The remainder of the day was spent holding off fierce German counterattacks and enduring intense shelling. Utilizing the captured telescope and the radio, the Canadians were able to bring deadly accurate artillery fire down upon their German attackers. Meanwhile, Tweedsmuir directed the rest of the battalion forward. By the end of the day, the town of Asoro was firmly in Canadian hands.
By this stage, it had become clear that General Montgomery had fundamentally miscalculated. His plan to capture Messina by breaking the German defenses through attacks by the 8th Army on both sides of Mount Etna was failing. Furthermore, the left flank of his army was perilously exposed, vulnerable to a potential German counterattack. The attack strategy up the coastal strip situated between Mount Etna and the sea was abandoned in favor of concentrating forces on the other side of the mountain. The 8th Army's movements continued to be hampered by a persistent lack of transport vehicles. Montgomery's troops fought bravely and doggedly. However, having fought extensively in North Africa and knowing more heavy fighting awaited them in Europe, they were less inclined to take the significant risks that greener, less exhausted troops might attempt. Spread thin across the front, the 8th Army urgently required both rest and reinforcement. The Germans attempted to slow the American advance from Palermo toward Messina along the rugged northern coast by systematically destroying the roads. American combat engineers performed excellent work, repairing the damage to ensure the drive could continue. Alexander and Montgomery had begun the campaign holding the view that the Americans were barely competent enough to guard the 8th Army's flank. The fierce battles on D-Day and D+1 demonstrated to Montgomery that the Americans had rapidly evolved into first-rate troops. The swift clearance of the island's western half unequivocally showcased American mobility. Montgomery recognized that completing the campaign successfully would require an all-out effort from both Allied armies. By this time, the Hermann Göring Panzer Division had shaken down into an effective fighting unit, and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, which had been a good unit from the start, was reinforced by the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division.
The terrain where the Germans had fortified their positions provided defensive advantages as strong as any found in the world. On July 25, Montgomery took the initiative and invited Patton to his headquarters to formulate collaborative plans for the remainder of the campaign. This initiative, coming from Montgomery rather than Alexander, was considered noteworthy by historians. Montgomery suggested that the United States 7th Army utilize Route 113 along the coast and Route 120 through the interior, the best roads in northeast Sicily, to capture Messina. He also granted Patton explicit permission to cross the established boundary line between the two armies, if doing so would aid his offensive operations. General Alexander joined the meeting near its conclusion, visibly testy. His mood was certainly not improved by being informed of how the rest of the campaign had already been decided upon by the two army commanders. His lack of effective leadership was evident to all. On July 23, the 45th Division reached the coastal road, Route 113, near Termini and Maurice. Elements of the division turned both east and west. The battalion moving east encountered newly arrived elements of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division at Campo Felice, located about 40 miles west of San Fratello, the northern end of the Germans' main defensive line.
Route 113 traversed a sequence of ridges that generally ran perpendicular to the coast, creating excellent natural defensive positions. To clear these obstacles, the Americans typically had to swing inland to flank the defenders. However, the few practical routes for flanking maneuvers made the American attacks predictable and led to heavy casualties. Once a ridge was cleared, combat engineers immediately moved in to repair the road. The Germans had liberally employed demolitions, so the excellent and continuous work of the engineers was the only factor that allowed the advance to maintain a reasonable pace. If a ridge was wide where it met the sea, the road was often cut into a narrow ledge on the side of the ridge. If the ridge was narrow, the Italians had usually constructed a tunnel through it. At Cape Calava, for instance, the Germans had collapsed a tunnel and caused a section of the roadbed to slide down a cliff face. Within 18 hours, the engineers had successfully suspended a bridge in the sky over the missing roadbed, capable of carrying a jeep. After 6 more hours of shoring and reinforcement, the bridge was strong enough to support larger vehicles. Since the Allies controlled the sea north of Sicily, they attempted to flank the Germans from the water. The first American attempt involved landing a reinforced battalion behind the German front lines. As the Germans fought their way past the landing force, both sides suffered heavy casualties. A second landing involved putting a larger force ashore, complete with armor and artillery. Relief forces took longer than anticipated to arrive, and supporting naval vessels were called back twice. Eventually, the survivors of the landing were forced to exfiltrate back to the main American lines. By the time the next amphibious landing was conducted, the advancing troops on land had already bypassed the intended landing site. Later in the campaign, the 8th Army reinforced a commando unit which landed in an attempt to cut off a rear guard, but the Germans successfully evaded the commandos. The final phase of the Sicilian campaign focused on cracking the fortified Etna line and capturing Messina. Allen's 1st Infantry Division completed the capture of Enna and then drove north toward Petralia. From Petralia, they turned east onto Route 120, advancing toward Troina. This movement initiated nearly a week of brutal fighting in one of the most controversial battles of the entire campaign. The American attackers faced severe challenges. There were no reliable maps, and fog prevented good aerial photographs until late in the battle. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans would continue to fight a delaying action, inflict casualties, and then withdraw to positions about 5 miles east of the town. The attackers were dangerously unaware that the Germans had the entirety of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division available for the defense. Troina held significant defensive advantages for the Germans. The barren terrain provided ideal conditions for German artillery observers, making them especially effective. Furthermore, the German guns were positioned strategically to control all movement along Route 120 and overlook the few available avenues of approach, making effective encirclement extremely difficult. Initially, only the attached 39th Infantry Regiment of the 9th Infantry Division was committed. This limited commitment did not allow for simultaneous movement against the town itself and the critical hill positions that were subjecting Route 120 to direct fire. The initial attack made some marginal progress, but the troops were violently thrown back by a German counterattack that night. The next day, the 39th attacked again, supported by another regiment and a battalion of French colonial infantry. Strong German artillery fire, however, halted the French and the 39th attacks in their tracks. The supporting regiment failed to advance more than half a mile. The subsequent day began with an attack across the entire divisional front, moving directly into the determined teeth of a tenacious German defense. German tactical doctrine emphasized vigorous counterattacks, and the defenders executed this with a vengeance that day. The lead battalion would certainly have been overrun had it not been for the massive American artillery support, totaling some 165 guns. Another German counterattack came so close to the American positions that the American artillery was forced to stop firing in support of their troops. One German maneuver was successfully defeated because German artillery observers were able to pinpoint the troops attempting to cross open, rocky ground. The battered German defenses held the American attackers to gains of only 1 or 2 miles. The attack the following day focused squarely on the town, but failed to expel the Germans. On August 5th, the rigid German defenses finally began to show signs of cracking. The newly arrived 60th Regimental Combat Team of the 9th Division reinforced the attempt to attack the town from the north. Simultaneously, the British and Canadians had made solid progress to the south, creating a threat to envelop Troina from that direction. The Germans had suffered significant losses, taking 1,600 casualties, representing approximately 40% of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. Furthermore, constant Allied air attacks had made their supply situation desperate. The Germans began to withdraw to new positions located around Sicily, though their vehicles and heavy equipment continued onward to the evacuation points near Messina. Results and discussion. The successful Axis evacuation of Sicily, which allowed more than 100,000 German and Italian troops to escape and continue fighting in Italy, rightly stained the Allied victory. Approximately 2 weeks before the Allied landings, the Germans, anticipating a future withdrawal to the Italian mainland, had appointed a naval officer to command the Messina transport facilities. He discovered a chaotic situation. There were multiple flotillas of ferries operated by various German and Italian agencies, including one managed by the German infantry itself. The officer reorganized these operations, added new routes outside the immediate Messina area, and increased the overall number of vessels in service. The most effective additions to the evacuation fleet were the Siebel ferries, which consisted of a pair of heavy bridge pontoons with a deck built over them and engines mounted in the rear, and flat-bottom barges equipped with a front ramp. These improvements boosted the daily cargo flow by a factor of 10. The defenses for the Strait of Messina and the transport system leading to and away from the strait were in disarray. German commander Albert Kesselring appointed a German colonel to organize the air defense assets in the area and manage the flow of troops and supplies. Allied air attacks against the evacuation were largely ineffective. They remained at high altitudes to avoid the intense anti-aircraft fire and failed to inflict enough damage to prevent the Axis troops from successfully crossing the strait. Moreover, the Italians possessed considerable artillery capable of damaging or sinking Allied warships, a capacity the Germans augmented with their own guns. Crucially, the Allies did not attempt any surface intersection using their naval power. The Axis units that successfully crossed the strait, having inflicted heavy damage on both the United States 7th Army and British 8th Armies, were rehabilitated and went on to provide Germany with substantial, continued good service in later campaigns. Thus, the Allied victory, though achieved, is correctly regarded as flawed. The entire battle was arguably conducted poorly by the Allied High Command. One can only hypothesize about the significantly different outcome if, on July 13th, General Alexander had ordered the United States 7th Army to move aggressively in a northeastward direction as Patton and Bradley desired. Such a move would have placed the leading American elements on the north coast heading east by approximately July 19th. The 29th Panzer Grenadier Division began arriving on the island on July 22nd and first encountered the 45th Division 2 days later. If the American forces had been further east at that time, before the Germans had time to fully establish their defensive positions, the conquest of Sicily might have concluded with the capture of a substantial number of Axis prisoners. Despite the operational flaws and the successful enemy evacuation, the battle for Sicily was still a momentous event that signaled a decisive shift in the fortunes of the belligerents. Strategically, the operation succeeded in reducing the immense pressure on the Soviet Union, as Adolf Hitler was forced to call off Operation Citadel, his major offensive in the east, on July 12th. The Germans never again mounted another successful offensive on the scale of Citadel. The fall of Sicily also triggered immediate political consequences in Italy itself. Benito Mussolini was ousted by the fascist Grand Council, and Italy subsequently declared itself to be neutral. Italy's defection created a massive logistical and military burden for Germany. Germany was compelled to divert troops to replace Italian soldiers guarding the Mediterranean coast of France and garrisoning the Balkans. Furthermore, Germany was forced to commit an entire army to garrison Italy itself. Germany committed most of 4 divisions to the Sicily battle, 3 of these were first-rate, well-equipped, and well-trained units. However, the commitment of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, which was deployed without adequate training, served as a painful indicator of future German problems. Such deployment of ill-prepared units would become increasingly common during the remainder of the war. By the time of the Allied landings in France, Germany still possessed a considerable number of well-trained and equipped divisions, mainly Panzer and Panzer Grenadier units. But many of the remaining divisions were poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and manned by soldiers whose loyalties were uncertain. The Sicilian campaign provided crucial clarity regarding American military performance. It made evident that the failures experienced by the United States forces during the early phase of the North African campaign were primarily attributable to insufficient training. Following the experience in Sicily, the United States could be confident that, with rare exceptions, any unit that had completed the prescribed Army training program would perform creditably in combat. Theater Commander Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower also underwent significant personal and professional improvement during his service in the Mediterranean. He acquired the necessary tactical and strategic experience to clearly understand the scope of authority the Supreme Commander needed. Based on these lessons, when preparing for the invasion of France, he demanded and received direct command of the whole vast enterprise. At Eisenhower's insistence, the tactical air forces were utilized before the Normandy landings to severely damage the French transportation system. This was intended to significantly slow the movement and buildup of enemy reinforcements, a factor that proved important in the Allies' eventual success in Normandy. After the difficult, month-long battle for Sicily, which ended with American troops securing Palermo and advancing relentlessly toward Messina, the balance of military forces had decisively shifted in favor of the Allies. While heavy fighting still lay ahead in the Italian campaign, the necessary foundation for overall victory had been established. Conclusion. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, was a military campaign marked by both tremendous external success against the Axis powers and profound internal tension within the Allied command. It served as the crucible where the American fighting spirit was fully proven, overcoming initial British skepticism that had been fueled by the initial poor showings in North Africa. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. was fiercely determined to demonstrate the American soldiers' equality or superiority in combat. This determination was realized during the intense counterattacks at Gela, where crucial naval support and the resilience of the American forces, including paratroopers and infantry, repulsed the formidable German and Italian armored thrusts. The Germans themselves recognized the extraordinary flexibility and rapid adaptability of the American army, a tradition of quick maneuver which was superior to every other army's mobility. However, the campaign was deeply scarred by failures in higher command, particularly the ineffective structure adopted at the insistence of the British. General Sir Harold Alexander, the Army Group commander, displayed a persistent lack of faith in the American soldier and failed to grasp the necessary reins of higher command. His decision to shift the inter-army boundary westward, limiting the dynamic United States 7th Army to a defensive flank position, while the already exhausted British 8th Army attempted the main thrust, was a strategic mistake that wasted American mobility and severely frustrated commanders like Major General Omar Bradley.
The success achieved by the Americans, exemplified by Patton's audacious rapid advance to capture Palermo, forced a recognition of the American capability and led General Bernard Law Montgomery to take the initiative to coordinate directly with Patton for the final push toward Messina. The subsequent grueling battles, such as the hard-fought capture of Troina by the United States 1st Infantry Division, demonstrated the fierce resistance of the German forces, particularly elite units like the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. Ultimately, the Axis achieved a major operational success in their ability to evacuate over 100,000 troops and much of their equipment across the Strait of Messina to the Italian mainland. This flawed victory highlighted the shortcomings in Allied air interdiction and naval coordination during the evacuation phase. Despite these flaws, Operation Husky yielded immense strategic consequences. It directly caused the downfall of Benito Mussolini and led to Italy's defection from the Axis, forcing Germany to commit vast military resources to occupy Italy and garrison the Balkans. Crucially, the campaign proved that inadequate training had been the root cause of earlier American failures. The experience gained transformed the United States Army into a highly competent, flexible, and mobile fighting machine. Moreover, it taught Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower vital lessons in command authority, which he successfully implemented in preparation for the subsequent landings in Normandy, ensuring he had direct command of the whole vast enterprise. The military and political balance of power had decisively shifted, marking Sicily as the beginning of the end for the Axis in the Mediterranean.